Y'all, welcome back to Got Your Six, the podcast where we talk about leadership beyond the title, beyond position, and beyond the highlight reel. I'm Dr. Traci, retired U.S. Army officer, business consultant, leadership coach, immersive keynote speaker, and founder of E&R Business Consulting. Around here, we talk about real leadership, the kind that gets tested under pressure, the kind that impacts your business, your family, your team, and your legacy because leadership is never about simply authority. It's about responsibility. And sometimes it's about carrying the weight that no one else can. Today was actually supposed to be a different episode. I had another podcast planned. The notes were done, the outline was ready, everything was set. Honestly, I even had a guest planned, but I really had something else come to my mind. A word found its way into my mind over the last few days and I really wanted to get on here and talk to y'all about it. The word sacrifice. Now, I know some of you probably just tightened up a little bit because people just can't stand this word for some reason. Because people hear that word and immediately think of loss, pain, exhaustion, burnout, giving too much, being taken advantage of. And honestly, that's why I wanted to talk about it today because sacrifice is a word leaders hear all of the time, but I don't think we spend enough time talking about what happens when sacrifice stops being something you do and something you start becoming to explain who you are. What happens when sacrifice becomes your identity? Let's talk about it. Let's dive into this. Picture it. The height of COVID, I'm on a video call. On my screen, four adults, one teacher, a school social worker, a principal, myself, and my daughter. Multiple degrees in that room, right? It's a virtual room, but so many levels of intelligence, so many leaders, right? Decades of combined experience. And we all had to assemble with the gravity of a national security briefing for exactly one reason because a 7-year-old said something on the playground. Buckle up, guys. You got to hear this because today's conversation is about sacrifice, the many faces of it, what it costs, what it gives. Here, let me share the story because I dove in right into the video call, but I wanted to get your attention because it was really important. So let me set this up properly. My daughter got a call from the school. Her daughter, our granddaughter, their teacher wanted a parent teacher conference. And a request like that, a teacher call you saying she wanted to have a parent teacher conference at not a normal time of the year and no details attached will send a good parent into the worst case scenarios before lunch. Honestly, y'all, listen to me. She sat down and she asked me, can I sit in on it? Because I do have an education degree. I have a psychology degree. I have sat in on both sides of this difficult conversation of whatever it's going to wind up being, right? She wanted backup on that call, not for me to show up and run the call, for me to just be her backup, right? So we logged in, we braced for something serious, and we got something serious, just not the kind they thought. Here was the concern. My granddaughter, second grade, told the other children on the playground that she was willing to sacrifice herself. That way, the other kids could go get water and she would hold the swings. She was willing to sacrifice herself. And supposedly, from the teachers, it scared the other kids. So the school escalated this concern. They talked to the teacher, the social worker, the principal. Formal meeting was set. The whole thing was set up to have this call with my daughter. But here's the part I want you to sit with because this is the entire episode in one sentence. Not one of them asked her what she meant by the statement. Think about that. A room full of professionals trained to work with children, right? And the response to a phrase they didn't understand was to sound the alarm, convene the adults, and build a case of fear. Nobody asked the obvious question to her. Where did you hear that? What does that word mean to you? What were you actually trying to say? They reacted to the behavior and skipped the diagnosis entirely. Because the thing was, had they asked her, they could have communicated to the other children if they really were scared. But on the other hand, they didn't do that. I, on the other hand, when I heard that, knew exactly where she had heard it because I am where she heard it from. Spent years in the army while my children were growing up, their entire lifetimes. They were army brats through and through. And every time I left them, there was some version of that same conversation that happened. Sorry, I get choked up because I didn't like leaving them. A child doesn't understand deployment. A child understands that you're leaving and they're not coming with you. So I gave them something true, transparent for them to understand. I told them I was willing to give my life in service. I told them I would sacrifice my comfort, my happiness, my time at the dinner table so they could grow up safely. So that way they did not have to be like those children in the other countries that I went to waving at us because they knew that we were coming to their country to help them be safe. It wasn't a speech, it was the truth. It's something they lived with through and through. And when our granddaughter came along, she got to hear those stories. She got to be a part of that understanding and that comfort in knowing that I came home every time, but I was going away to keep my family safe. They heard it. All of them heard it across the years, across deployments, across now generations. My granddaughter was a part of this. So when that little girl stood on the playground and she said she was willing to sacrifice herself, it wasn't in crisis. She was repeating the most loving and most serious thing she had ever heard a grown up say to her mother, to her uncle. She took it exactly the way children take everything without footnotes. And a room full of adults decided it was an emergency. The child wasn't the one who missed the point that day. We all were. They all were. And you know what struck to me afterward? That they misunderstood her. What struck to me was realizing how carefully people watch us, children, employees, teams, families. They don't just listen to what we say, they watch how we live, they watch how we prioritize, what we celebrate, what we complain about, and what we sacrifice. They're learning leadership from observation long before they learn it in instruction. Here's why this is a leadership episode. Watch what the adults did because leaders do the same thing every single day. They saw a behavior, they didn't like it, a word that made them uncomfortable. And instead of asking where it came from, they treated the symptom as a diagnosis. Guys, communication is key. If you don't ever talk to anybody and understand what's happening around you, as a leader, you cannot be functional. Leaders do this constantly. Someone underperforms, we discipline the output instead of asking what changed. Someone becomes quiet, we call them disengaged instead of asking them what's happening. Communication is key. We react to the behavior, we skip the content, we manage symptoms, right? And we miss the causes. If you want one takeaway before we even get to sacrifice, here it is. Ask first, react second, and every single time you'll be able to get the communication and understanding you need. Now, let's talk about sacrifice itself because sacrifice wears many faces. There is the sacrifice of presence, the time you never get back, the birthdays, the recitals, the ordinary Tuesdays that someone else got to experience. There's the sacrifice of comfort, the hard conversations, the difficult decisions, the responsibility no one else wants. There is the sacrifice of being misunderstood, or even the sacrifice of being understood. You make a decision based on information others don't have, and they call you cold. You carry criticism for doing what needed to be done. There is also the sacrifice of ego, giving away credit, giving away recognition, giving away the spotlight to someone else so they can too grow. And then there's the sacrifice of self, the willingness to give everything. And that's where things get dangerous. There's also another face of sacrifice that leaders rarely talk about. This is the one I'm talking about right now, the sacrifice of self. It's the moment sacrifice stops being something you do and starts becoming who you are. At first, it looks admirable. You're the one who's always stays late to work, the one who always fixes the problem, the one everyone depends on, and the one who always says yes. People praise it. Organizations love it. They reward it. Families depend on it. And eventually, everything subtle happens behind the curtain. You stop asking whether you should sacrifice. You simply assume you will because it becomes part of your identity. You're the dependable one, the responsible one, the fixer, the strong one. Do you recognize yourself in any of this? The word sacrifice is so powerful. And over time, the role becomes so familiar that you no longer recognize the cost. I've seen this in military leaders and executives, business owners, even in parents. And if I'm being honest, I've seen it in myself one too many times, even outside of the Army. There were seasons of my Army career where sacrifice became absolutely normal. I was missing birthdays, I was missing holidays, missing things just became normal. But then I became a business owner, a different battlefield, a different mission, same old habit, same old carrying everything. Because even though I'm a business owner, I'm still a wife, I'm still a mom, I'm still a grandparent. And I love being a part of all the things because I made a decision when I left the Army that sacrificing had to change. But I still give my all to everything. And I still believed that if I worked harder and gave more, that was the sign of leadership. Until one day I had to ask myself the difficult question: what if I removed all the roles? Army officer, business owner, consultant, coach, keynote speaker, mother, grandmother. Who am I underneath all of that? Because when sacrifice becomes your identity, you eventually forget the difference between serving people and disappearing for them. I had to recognize this in myself. It's why I wanted to do this recording so badly, because I did want to share the crazy story about my granddaughter. But here's the thing: I had to recognize this in myself. Here's the reframe I want to leave you guys with: the healthiest leaders don't view sacrifice as a loss, they view it as stewardship, gratitude, purpose. There is a difference. Loss happens to you. Sacrifice is something you choose. And when you choose it for purpose, you believe in, like I did when I was in the military and choosing service over everything, it made a difference. Again, when you choose it for a purpose you believe in, it stops draining you and starts defining your character on the inside, showing up for yourself, not because suffering is noble, but because contribution matters, right? Here's where leaders sometimes get it wrong. There's a line between sacrifice and self assurance. And many leaders don't see it until they've crossed it. That boundary gets into a ripple. Sacrifice has direction. It serves a mission. It serves a purpose. Y'all, I need you to listen. Here's what I want you to carry with you after listening to this. First, when people do something you don't understand, before you react, ask questions. Communication is key. The behavior is a symptom. The why is the diagnosis. Second, sacrifice is not your punishment for being responsible. It is evidence that you have something worth giving and people worth giving it to. And third, know exactly what your sacrifice serves, because sacrifice with purpose builds something so much bigger. Sacrifice without purpose costs you as a human being. And here's the question I want to leave you with: what are you sacrificing right now? And more importantly, who would you be if you stopped? What if you peeled all those labels away? What if you peeled all those titles and put them in a basket? Sit with that, because sacrifice builds families, it builds teams, it builds businesses, it builds nations. But sacrifice was never meant to become your identity, it was meant to serve your purpose. And there's a difference. And that's the episode. And that's why I wanted to talk about this. There is a difference to sacrifice. What is it that you're serving and why? If today's conversation challenged your thinking, share it with another leader who needs to hear it. And if you're looking for deeper conversations, practical leadership tools, and a community of leaders committed to growth, I invite you to join us inside of my one of my membership groups, my Leaders Lounge, my lounge, or my executive lounge. You'll find the link in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like, subscribe, and follow the podcast so you never miss a conversation. Yes, I do shift sometimes and I do go off on a tangent because I have these ideas that I want to share with you guys. I want you to understand how leadership can be different than what we all thought it is and what it can be. Until next time, remember, leadership isn't about being in charge, it's about taking care of those you are in charge of, to include yourself. Keep leading from the front, keep showing up with purpose. And as always, I've got your six.